Hi, everybody. Welcome to our lecture about endocrine system. So to give you an overview of the endocrine system, this is a system that produces hormones, but does not use ducts to transfer it from one location to another. Rather, you use your circulatory system to transfer these hormones from one place to another. Hormones do travel throughout the body, and they are going to basically cause some sort of change within your system. These changes are definitely last longer when it's compared to nervous system, which has some overlapping function with your endocrine system. Endocrine system works very closely with your nervous system, and you'll see that as we go through the lecture, talking about structures like hypothalamus, pineal body or pineal gland. We'll talk about the adrenal medulla, which is part of the nervous system as well as play a role in terms of endocrine system. Now, some of the main functions that the endocrine system can do is maintaining your homeostasis, which basically maintaining your internal environment. It does help with controlling your growth. We'll talk about basically your growth hormone in that sense and some of the other hormones that are involved in the process. Metabolism is a big one that has associated with your thyroid hormone, stressing defense when your body is basically dealing with some sort of physiological or emotional stress. The endocrine system has a main role to try to control the body and make sure that everything runs smoothly. Fluctuation in your blood chemistry, which is typically we're talking about ion concentrations like calcium, potassium, sodium, even your water balance. All of these are controlled with your endocrine system. Again, when you're comparing endocrine system with the nervous system, both of these are taking action in terms of controlling and coordinating your body activities. The difference is nervous system is really fast because it's using electrical impulses in terms of means of communication, versus endocrine system is using hormone and it's released into your circulation to make that communication happen. So nervous system results are usually fast but short-lived, versus hormones released from your endocrine system takes a while for it to basically create a response. However, that response lasts a longer period of time. Now, when we're looking at the endocrine organs, there are two main categories. One we identified as pure endocrine organs, which basically means they're dedicated to your endocrine systems. These include your pituitary gland, your pineal gland, thyroid gland, parathyroid, and adrenal glands. Versus ones that are also considered as part of another organ system. These include your pancreas, which belongs to your digestive system, thymus, which belongs to your lymphatic system, gonads belonging to your reproductive, hypothalamus, part of your nervous system, and kidneys, part of your renal system. So do keep in mind that even though they're all categorized and are categorized as endocrine organs and are releasing hormones, they don't all belong to the same larger category. Logically, because the way that our body transports hormones is blood, and then they are going to be richly vascularized, that allows for that hormone to be effectively transported from location to location. And because of highly vascularized structures, they also have a significant amount of lymph vessels. It's kind of logical, they go hand in hand. Now, when we think about how your body actually knows when to release a hormone, we are thinking about three major means or mechanism of a stimulation. One of the main one is known as humoral. Humoral is basically when a gland within your endocrine system is responsible for basically monitoring any changes, and when it notices that change happening, then it can basically create a response to that. This is usually associated with nutrients or ions that are present in your blood. For instance, the best example that always comes to mind is control of calcium in your bloodstream. So again, this is and I'll show you, this is a parathyroid hormone, which gets released when there's an imbalance in calcium level. Neural, as the name implies, we're talking about involvement of your nervous system. So release of these hormones depend on an signaling or a stimulation directly from the nervous system through a nerve impulse. Best example of that would be the way your nervous system controls the adrenal medulla to release the two main hormones of epinephrine and norepinephrine in the case of a sympathetic response, which also known as fight or flight response. If these words sound unfamiliar to you, please go back to your first semester course when we talked about nervous system, and we talked about the two main branches of the autonomic nervous system, which were sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, the last option that we have, which is, I would say, one of the more complex of the three, and the most complex of the three, is the stimulation via another hormone. So this is when a release of a hormone depends on the presence or a stimulation from a primary hormone. So for instance, when we're talking about the thyroid hormone, release from the thyroid gland, that hormone by itself is under control of a hormone coming from the pituitary gland called thyroid stimulating hormone. So basically, hormonal release is controlled by another hormone. Now, when you have this reaction or this kind of chain reaction or domino effect, when you have one, it causes a secretion of another. This hormone is referred to as a tropic hormone. So tropic hormones are basically, again, this pattern or chain reaction you see when one hormone is released, then it causes the release of a secondary hormone. Here is a depiction of what I've been describing to you guys. Again, humoral, which is the simplest one. There's blood vessels coming into the organ, in this case, your parathyroid gland, these little tiny dots. And when they notice that the calcium level is low, parathyroid hormone is released and helps you increase your calcium level in the bloodstream. Second scenario is where your nervous system, in this case your spinal cord, is communicating with your adrenal medulla, and that causes the release of hormones such as norepinephrine or epinephrine, that are known as adrenaline. Hormonal stimulation, again, you have involvement of multiple hormones. For instance, in this case, you have hypothalamus releasing a hormone that causes the anterior pituitary gland to release another hormone. And these hormones are going to go and affect other glands within the endocrine system. So always think about the hormonal stimulation as kind of this chain reaction that takes place when one hormone stimulates another. And again, these type of hormones are identified as tropic hormones. Now, let's go ahead and move on to identifying the main type of hormones that we have in our body. So there's two main categories. One that are identified as lipid or steroid based. These are originating from cholesterol. And the second category that we have, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, are protein based. So these are amines, peptides, basically a full protein size. And the main difference when you're comparing these two groups is their characteristics in terms of, are they able to pass through the phospholipid bilayer membrane of your cell? Now, again, if you guys don't recall, when you think back at one of the earliest lectures we had in our first semester, we talked about a cell having these, basically a membrane around it. This membrane is the phospholipid, I'm kind of going upward, sorry guys, phospholipid bilayer, which basically is made up of phosphate and, I'm not fully spelling everything, lipid. So it only allows the specific components to pass. If you are fat soluble, these molecules can easily pass through. If you're protein based, then your passage through the membrane is definitely not there. So steroid based, which basically come from cholesterol, basically a fat, can pass through the plasma membrane. And they can eventually go through the nucleus and directly target the DNA. So if you guys recall again from your knowledge from the previous semester, DNA eventually can be transcribed to make mRNA or RNA, and that RNA can be used for synthesizing new proteins. So having this capacity, these lipid-based hormones can get into the cell and directly do the job themselves. Best example would be when there are when you have, for instance, testosterone increasing the production of the sperm inside a male testes. Again, this hormone testosterone is derived from cholesterol, so it can easily get into the cell and eventually affect the sperm production. Here's a depiction of what I'm describing for you guys. Again, you have a steroid hormone. It is passing through the bilayer membrane of the cell. This is your nucleus right here. So it is passing through the nucleus when it's bound to the receptor. You don't need to know that detail. You do need to know it goes to your DNA. It binds directly to your DNA, which causes the production of or transcription into mRNA, and that eventually becomes the protein that your body needs. And again, that stimulation causes a major shift in terms of the action of the cells. Now, on the other hand, again, as I mentioned earlier, you have hormones that are identified as non-steroids. These are hormones that are protein-based or amino acid-based, like peptides and just simply amines. These hormones, because of their characteristics, are unable to pass through the phospholipid bilayer, and consequently need to rely on other proteins that are located inside the plasma membrane to get the job done. So let's take a look at this picture. Right here you have your hormone. This is a protein-based hormone. So it uses this kind of messenger system, and you don't need to know the name of these for our purpose. This is more biochemistry, but you can see there's changes in this protein. A G protein is inactive, and through its interaction with the hormone and its receptors becomes active. That affects another protein, in this case called phospholipase. And again, this pattern continues, and that eventually have some sort of effect or change on your cell. So this pathway that we're showing, again, is relying on what we identify as secondary messenger system. A typical one is a cyclic AMP that eventually alters the activity of your cell. A really good examples of this, again, are hormones that are released by your pituitary gland. Some of the examples are your oxytocin, your luteinizing hormone, and your vasopressin or ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, or thyroid releasing hormones. And again, these are just, if you're never have studied hormones, I'm just kind of throwing names at you. It's okay, you don't need to know that right now. All I want to kind of get you used to is the abbreviations we use for the hormones, and we are going to use a lot of abbreviations. So going to a little more detail in terms of what are some of the effects that these hormones have in our body. And again, we're not distinguishing at this point, are we talking about a steroid or non-steroid hormone? We're just talking about hormones in general. So some of them can actually have an effective, direct effect on the proteins that are located in the plasma membrane. Now, what are these proteins actually do is they control how much ions get in or out of your cells. Again, by ions, we're talking about sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride, etc. So changing the permeability of your plasma membrane by closing or opening these channels, you can have a significant effect on your cell. So hormones can have that control. You could also have a scenario where an enzyme is inactive, it's circulating through your system, and by releasing a hormone and having that hormone interacting with that enzyme, you activate that enzyme. Activation of that enzyme can have basically major consequences in terms of changes in the body. The opposite can also happen when you have an active enzyme doing its job, continuously doing its job, and your body notices that something needs to change. So a release of the hormone can come in and causes that enzyme to be deactivated. And as a result, basically in stopping or halting the process that that enzyme was accomplishing. You can have scenarios, as I mentioned earlier, you have low levels of protein in your system and you need to increase that level of protein for whatever the purpose is. So you can literally stimulate your body and your cells to produce more of that specific proteins. Cell division, the process of mitosis is can be stimulated by the presence of specific hormones. This is extremely important in terms of fetal development as well as, or embryonic development, as well as when the child is undergoing basically a phase of growth before reaching adulthood. You have the capacity of the cells that secrete something outside the cell, and these cells can increase their activity when there is a specific hormones present. Now, please do note that I'm not going to go detail and provide examples for each of the hormones. We're talking about some of the essential hormones found in our systems. There are definitely more hormones in our body. There's a lot more going on than just a simple description that I'm providing for you. But the goal of this lecture is to kind of familiarize you with the path some of these hormones takes and some of the major changes you would expect to see if there is an elevation or decrease in the level of these hormones within your body. Now, when we're talking about the hormones, you also do need to keep in mind that these hormones are always in a feedback loop, which is really, really good. So always think about those feedback loop in terms of homeostasis, right? So if you have this perfect range and you deviate either going above or below this perfect range of numbers, then your feedback loop kicks in and tries to return your hormonal level either down back to the level or up back to the normal level. So if it notices, for instance, the blood concentration of a specific hormone is low, then it stimulates the secretion of that hormone. And if your body notices that the level of the hormone exceed what is acceptable in terms of maximum range, then the production of that hormone is halted until the level is back to normal. Now, we already introduced the major endocrine system, endocrine organ within this system in terms of either being pure or being part of another organ system. But we're going to kind of look at it now from a different perspective in terms of, let's list some of the major organs and then look at their location and what is their main function and what do they actually accomplish in our body. So right here we have a pineal gland, which is essential in terms of your sleep and wake cycle. You have your hypothalamus and pituitary gland connected together. I'll go more into detail about that. Within your neck region, right in front of your trachea, you have your parathyroid and thyroid gland. Right below that, sitting superior to your heart. So your heart would be right here. So superior to your heart, you have your thymus gland. Right superior to your kidneys, you have your adrenal gland, and adrenal glands are basically also called supraadrenal glands as well. We have pancreas, which is technically, again, part of your digestive system, but it's listed. They didn't show kidney as one of the endocrine organs, but kidneys also produce hormones such as EPO. So we are going to list them here for the purpose of covering the motion and the information, but we're not going to discuss EPO in this case. And then lastly, we have gonads. In this case, they depicted both male and females, the ovaries and testes respectively. So let's dive into one of the most important endocrine glands we have, which is your pituitary gland. Very small. If you guys recall your skull and the structures within your skull, it sits in a specific structure, this little kind of dip inside your sphenoid bone called sella turcica. This pituitary gland is actually connected to your hypothalamus. So there's a direct link or connection between these two structures, and that connection is called the infundibulum. Pituitary gland itself, and I'm going to show you this on a picture, it's broken down to two lobes. You have your anterior lobe and you have your posterior lobe. And again, here is your hypothalamus on the top, and the connection between the pituitary gland, that would be your infundibulum. Now, when you look at the glands, or sorry, another name for the pituitary gland, for the anterior pituitary gland, we use the word adrenal hypophysis, and for posterior gland, we use the word neurohypophysis. Neuro in this case implies that they are technically part of the nervous system, and you'll hear why that is the case in just a minute. So let's go ahead and talk about the hypothalamus and its relationship to anterior pituitary gland. So anterior pituitary gland is one of the organs that produces many tropic hormones, which basically means these hormones are not going to be doing anything themselves, rather it's going to control the activity and release of hormone from a different endocrine gland. Anterior pituitary gland produces its own hormones and it stores its own hormones. However, if it wants to release any of these hormones, any of these 6 hormones that we'll discuss, it needs to receive a signal from your hypothalamus. If anterior pituitary gland wants to halt the release of a hormone, it also needs to receive a signal from your hypothalamus. So even though your anterior pituitary gland is producing the hormone, it has no control on its releasing process. So hypothalamus can send a signal to the anterior pituitary gland by releasing things called releasing hormones. Now, as the name implies, these hormones from the hypothalamus are going to prompt or stimulate the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. Now, if I want to stop this process, then your hypothalamus is going to release what we identify as inhibiting hormones, which basically inhibit or turn off the release and secretion of the hormones from your anterior pituitary gland. So let me show you this in a picture, and I will go into detail more about that. So right here, you have your hypothalamus up here. You have your your anterior pituitary gland right here, or your adrenal hypophysis. And then you have the gland that your pituitary gland is communicating with. So hypothalamus in this scenario is sending what we identify as releasing hormone, or RH. RH goes and transport that signal. RH basically is transported through the infundibulum, which was the connection, to the anterior pituitary gland. When anterior pituitary gland identifies the releasing hormone, it releases its own hormone. So in this case, hormone 1 gets released from your anterior pituitary gland. Now again, because these are tropic hormones, hormone 1 travels through the blood and reaches your secondary organ within the endocrine system, and that causes the release of the second hormone in the sequence. Now, this hormone can go to its target cell and accomplish what it needs to do. Now, looking at the name of the hormone again, the releasing hormone in this scenario would be TRH. From the, again, look at the color coding. This would be from your hypothalamus. TSH would be from your pituitary gland, or your anterior pituitary gland more specifically. And thyroid gland would be releasing your thyroid hormone, which is the last structure. Another example, you have CRH, the releasing hormone that triggers the release of a hormone called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, which targets supraadrenal gland or your adrenal gland and causes the release of hormone called glucocorticoids. Now, you also have a hormone called GnRH, which is gonad releasing hormones, which causes the release of FSH and LH, which eventually target the secondary endocrine organs, testes and ovaries, and causes major changes inside the body. Now, again, it is complicated, so I'm not going to tell you that this is going to be simple, but we're going to take it one step at a time and look at each of the glands and the process as they go through their hormonal secretion and their effect on the target cells. So again, let's go back to anterior lobe or anterior pituitary gland. How does your hypothalamus communicate with your anterior pituitary gland? So for that, it is using a network of blood vessels that connects hypothalamus to your anterior pituitary gland, which you can see right here. So right here, what you have within your hypothalamus, which is part of your nervous system, you have these neurons. Again, kind of looking at your neurons, we had this kind of a structure. I'm just kind of depicting a simple versions of this. This is your neuron, you have your cell body, you have your dendrites right here, you have a single long axon, and then at the end, you have your axon terminal, which is, in this case, would be located right here. So when these neurons notice a requirement for release of a hormone, because they're basically monitoring the changes in the body. So these neurons notice that there should be a hormone at a higher level in your system. So these neurons start to get activated, they get excited. They send an electrical impulse down through the axon, which reaches the axon terminal. Now, these axon terminal are connected to a capillary network right here, identified as primary capillary plexus. So what these basically hypothalamus is doing, these neurons are going to release either a releasing hormone, depending on the condition, or they're going to release what we identify as inhibiting hormone. Now, regardless of which one of these categories of hormones they release, these hormones are going to first get introduced into the primary capillary plexus. They go through these blood vessels you see right here, called the hypophyseal portal veins, and then eventually go into the surface of the anterior pituitary gland through a capillary network called secondary capillary plexus. Now, if the hormone that was released from the hypothalamus were the releasing hormone, then what does that cause? It causes your anterior pituitary gland to release either TSH, FSH, LH, ACTH, GH, or prolactin, depending on what the signal was. In some cases, as I mentioned, you could have the opposite. You can have what we identified as inhibiting hormones, right? So hypothalamus is sending a signal, it passes through, and it prevents your anterior pituitary gland from releasing the corresponding hormone. So if I ask you, how does the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary gland, what I'm looking for is, you're looking at neurons that have their axon terminal at the beginning of the infundibulum, which is right here. They release either releasing hormone or inhibiting hormone into the primary capillary plexus, which is transported through the hypophyseal portal vein, down to the secondary capillary plexus on the anterior pituitary gland. And depending on the signaling, either releasing or inhibiting, it causes the stimulation of the hormone or inhibition of the hormone release. So we have learned about anterior pituitary gland, the fact that it makes its own hormones, but the release is under the hypothalamus. We learned that most of the hormones that gets released from the anterior pituitary glands are tropic hormones, which means they are going to basically control the release of hormone from another gland. Now we're going to take a look at each of these individual hormones and what they actually do in our body. So let's take a look. Anterior pituitary gland releases these hormones. There are other hormones which I'm not discussing right now. Growth hormone, which is shorthand to GH, also known as the somatotropic hormone or somatotropin. Prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone or TSH. Adrenocorticotropic hormone or ACTH. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. So here is a depiction of what gets released from your anterior pituitary gland under the control of the hypothalamus. Again, you have your ACTH, which eventually targets your adrenal gland. We have TSH being released from the anterior pituitary gland, targeting the thyroid gland. We have growth hormone, which is not a tropic hormone, but rather it targets liver and the muscles. You have prolactin that targets the mammary tissue in females during pregnancy. And you have the FSH and LH, which targets both gonads, male and female, and important in development of the gametes, which are the sex cells, as well as the sex hormones such as testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. So we're gonna start by looking at our growth hormone. So growth hormone is essential during essential for children in terms of if it is low or high, it can make a significant change in terms of that individual's features. That being said, having different levels of growth hormone in an adult can also causes significant change in that individual's health. So what does the growth hormone accomplish? So growth hormone that gets released from the pituitary gland under the control of the hypothalamus targets your muscles, as you can see. It targets your bones and it targets your liver and fat tissue. So how does it actually accomplishes this? So by targeting this tissue, first of all, it can metabolize fat. So basically says fat is a really good source of energy for me. And when I'm growing, I need that energy. So I'm gonna tap it and use it as the main source of energy for my growth. So I tell my students a lot of times when your child is undergoing a growth spurt, you notice that they lose their baby fat, right? So they grow in length, but they also lose that extra fat that they might have had when they weren't growing as much. Typically, fat undergoes a process called gluconeogenesis, which helps increase the blood glucose. Basically, you produce additional glucose molecules, which is the main fuel source for your cells. Growth hormone also targets liver and causes a release of a protein called IGF-1. I don't want you to know what it stands for, but IGF-1 targets your bone and your muscle. In terms of your muscle, it helps you increase your muscle mass. So basically you are making larger muscles to match the growth. And in terms of the bone, it targets your epiphyseal cartilage, if you guys remember that from your previous course, which is basically where the bone grows from. So by targeting the epiphyseal plate, you actually can help the bone grow in both length and thickness. So that's the job of the growth hormone when you have normal levels of this within your system. What happens if you have a hormonal imbalance? Now, typically when we describe hormonal imbalance, we describe it as hyposecretion. Hypo mean below something or below. Oh, sorry guys. And hypersecretion, that's not what's supposed to happen. Sorry guys, so give me 1 second. Okay, so hyposecretion means falling below normal levels, and hypersecretion implies that you're going above the normal level. So in children, if you have hyposecretion of the growth hormone, that leads to dwarfism in children. The interesting fact is, if you are taking your child to a pediatrician and they're doing their normal, basically, well-being check to make sure everything is normal and they're growing okay, and the pediatrician notices that the child growth is falling back, they can check to see the level of the growth hormone. And if they notice that the level is low, then they can start what we identify as injections of growth hormone for a duration of time. This injection is usually daily and lasts a while. However, if it is caught on time, the children can undergo normal growth spurts like any other kids and basically catch up on in terms of their height. Hypersecretion of the growth hormone can cause gigantism in children, which is basically means you have way too much hormone being released from the anterior pituitary gland, typically as a result of a tumor, and that really high level of growth hormone increases your metabolism of fat, increases the growth of the bone and the muscle. So basically you will end up with somebody that's really tall. And that's the proper terminology would be gigantism. Now, if the increase or hypersecretion of the growth hormone happens in adults, it causes a condition called acromegaly, which is where you would see symptoms of the person over time having really kind of large hands and feet compared to the rest of their body, and the bony features in their face also changes significantly. So kind of putting these terminology in terms of clinical situations, this is what you will see. Again, and I don't know if these numbers are up to date. I didn't really check for the recent one. I think this is a couple-year-old. But the person basically suffering from dwarfism is about 2 feet 5 inches versus the tallest person recorded was 8 foot 1 inch. And again, that change, that significant difference that you see, mainly is a result of the growth hormone being imbalanced in children. Opposite of that, I'm sorry, not opposite of that, but in case of increasing growth hormone in adults, you see the case of acromegaly on the left. You can see basically a normal 16-year-old girl. And because of the hypersecretion of the growth hormone, you can see the main thing being the facial features are being changed, being basically much more dense and big, and you can see a significant physical change in this individual's feature. Thyroid stimulating hormone, which is another hormone which released from the anterior pituitary gland, kind of highlighting what I'm saying again. So you have your hypothalamus releasing the thyroid releasing hormone for your anterior pituitary gland. And when anterior pituitary gland notices the high levels of TRH, then you're going to have an increase in your TSH. TSH goes ahead and targets the last gland in this pathway, which is your thyroid gland. stimulates your thyroid gland to increase the production of both thyroid hormones, which are identified as T3 and T4. I'm not going to describe the imbalances in TSH here. I will describe them in terms of the effects on the thyroid gland and the release of the thyroid hormones later on in the PowerPoint. We have adrenocorticotropic hormone, shorthand ACTH, another hormone released. This is again under the control of the hypothalamus, and itself targets the adrenal gland sitting superior to your kidneys. Its target is the adrenal cortex, and it controls the release of two main categories of hormones from the adrenal gland called glucocorticotropic hormones and mineralocorticoids. Now, in this scenario, when we're talking about ACTH, there are not many cases of the hyposecretion of this hormone, so it is rare, so there's not much studies happening on that one, but hypersecretion causes a medical condition called Cushing's disease. I will describe this in more detail, again, when we're talking about the adrenal cortex, because these changes are not visible as a result of the ACTH, but it's the final gland and the final changes that are going to be visualized in terms of medical condition. So just briefly going over some of the common symptoms you see, it includes build-up of fat tissue or adipose tissue in the upper portion of the body. The person typically gets a round face. There are other changes in terms of the hormones, and again, fluctuation in terms of amount of water you sustain, the amount of salt you sustain in the body. Now, the two hormones that are related to your gonads, the FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, are involved in terms of both maturation of the egg and sperm, and I put those on quote to quote, and also the release of the sex hormones such as testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. So what is the job of follicle stimulating hormone? Follicle stimulating hormone in females are going to allow the immature egg or immature oocyte, which is placed inside a follicle, to basically undergo maturation. So kind of putting that again in perspective for you, and we'll go into a lot more detail about that in the reproductive system later on. But in case of a, sorry, I think I lost the connection to my pen. All right, so in terms of an oocyte, which is basically an egg, here is your follicle, and at the center of that you have an egg. So this is your oocyte, which is again your egg, and surrounding that you have a follicle. We'll go again into more detail later on for that. But when we talk about follicle stimulating hormone, this is what they're talking about. Growth of that follicle, and from that, you're also getting the maturation of the oocyte within that. So when you have elevation of the FSH, you allow the follicle to fully grow to its mature form called Graafian follicle, making that oocyte ready for the process of ovulation. And you're also controlling the level of the estrogen being produced by controlling the levels of FSH. So in females, the FSH does a lot more job as the female reproductive system is more complex to support pregnancy and embryonic development. In terms of males, the FSH has extremely important function, which is basically stimulation of sperm production. So fluctuation in FSH can have an effect in terms of maturation of the sperm and causing the lowering of the sperm count in males. So hypersecretion of the FSH, there hasn't really been any major changes that can be noted if either male or female have an elevated levels of FSH. However, hyposecretion basically prevents both male and female from reaching their sexual maturation. Again, how it does that, if you have low FSH, the oocyte and the follicle cannot mature, which basically means there is no egg to be fertilized. And in case of males, if the sperm level is low because of low FSH, the chance of the sperm being able to effectively fertilize an egg significantly declines. Now, luteinizing hormone, or LH, again targets your gonads, which are the ovaries and testes for female and male respectively. In females, again, it accomplishes more activity or more jobs. It helps the process of ovulation, which basically is when your egg gets released from the ovary and can now travel through the fallopian tube into the uterus. It also stimulates the release of the hormones, progesterone from the ovaries. And the importance of that is that it's literally preparing that your uterus is ready to receive and implant an fertilized egg or a fertilized egg. So basically preparing the uterus for a possible pregnancy. In males, it is essential because it is responsible for production of testosterone. And as we know, testosterone is extremely important in terms of carrying secondary sexual characteristics, maintaining the level of blood in your body, and many other functions that are connected. FYI, a lot of people assume that male and females are limited to their own sex hormones, but do keep in mind both male and female carry all the hormones regardless. Their levels might be fluctuated significantly depending on the gender. Again, hypersecretion of LH is similar to FSH. There is no specific or important impact on the sexual features or characteristic of the individual, nor male or female. Hyposecretion, however, logically will have a significant effect in terms of sexual maturation of that individual. So again, if testosterone level is low in male, the secondary sex characteristics will be absent, as well as many other features. In females, the chances of ovulation would be pretty low because the egg will never be released. And even if the egg is present, the chance of the uterus being ready for that pregnancy might be limited. Prolactin is hormone that is typically associated with females. It is targeting the mammary tissue when a woman is pregnant, and it causes the production of the milk, development and production of the milk within the mammary tissue. As of yet, there is no main function associated with prolactin in terms of males. So if you do have hyposecretion or low levels of prolactin in males, you really won't see a significant change. However, in females, if you have low levels of prolactin during pregnancy, that typically means that after childbirth, I should say, your milk production remains low. And there's a lot of products in the market that advertises that it can help a woman or a mother increase their milk production. Some works, some doesn't. Depends on the individual as well. Hypersecretion of prolactin can have a significant negative impact in males and causes impotency. In females, however, the biggest problem a woman will have is high milk production, which is called galactorrhea. Not significantly negative per se in terms of what we identify as negative for women or females, but for males, it can have a really significant negative impact. Okay, I'm gonna stop this part 1, and we'll start part 2 with your posterior pituitary gland, and we'll continue from there.